Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil assets are destroying the Russian economy and forcing Moscow to face the biggest financial crisis since the fall of the Soviet Union. In the last few months, Ukraine has targeted refineries on the Russian mainland, oil platforms in the Caspian Sea, and shadow fleet tankers in the Black Sea, with the aim of dismantling the infrastructure that powers Russia's war machine. Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the sales of oil and natural gas accounted for 50% of Russia's budget revenues. Today, they are expected to account for only 23% of the state budget, as Ukrainian attacks force refineries to shut down and the shadow fleet to look for alternative routes to avoid Ukrainian drones. Last year, Ukrainian attacks were even able to shut down almost 40% of Russia's entire refining capacity, which forced Moscow to import diesel and gasoline from Belarus and Kazakhstan. This is a big development considering that in the last 2 decades, Russia has been able to accumulate massive financial resources from oil sales. The Russian oil companies exported oil through the pipeline system that runs through most of Eastern and Central Europe, and with the help of tanker ships from the Baltic Sea and Black Sea. This made it possible for Moscow to turn oil into a weapon of influence and make the European continent dependent on its energy supplies. At one point, the former Chancellor of Germany and the former Foreign Minister of Austria joined the board of directors of Russia's oil company Rosneft after making deals that favored the Russian businesses. The Russian state-owned natural gas company Gazprom also financed political parties across Europe, from Germany's AfD to France's National Rally. In addition to that, Moscow ran active campaigns against European domestic energy production, funding environmental groups that opposed fracking and nuclear power to ensure Europe remained reliant on Russian supplies. Thanks to this, by the end of 2021, the European Union countries imported over 25% of their oil from Russia, which helped Putin build his war chest and prepare for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Then, when Russia fully invaded Ukraine in 2022, Putin expected a quick victory and also believed that the European countries would never risk interfering in the war and cutting off Russian oil supplies because the economic pain would be too significant for them. However, he was wrong. Within months, the European Union announced a comprehensive ban on Russian oil imports that included crude oil and petroleum products, after which countries across the continent turned to Norway, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other producers to replace the Russian oil supplies. As a result, by the end of 2025, the oil supplies from Russia to the European Union accounted for less than 2% of the overall supplies. Only countries like Hungary and Slovakia, that are currently being run by Russian-backed politicians, are the only 2 states that still heavily rely on Russian supplies. But that should change soon following the decision of the European Union to fully stop imports of Russian oil and natural gas by 2027. Facing the loss of the European market, Russia had no choice but to redirect its oil exports toward Asia. India and China became Moscow's economic lifeline. Russian tankers that once sailed through the Baltic Sea to the Dutch ports now made the longer journey around Asia to ports in India and China. At the same time, Russia began to sell its oil at steep discounts just to keep the oil flowing and revenue coming in. As a result, India's imports of Russian oil skyrocketed from nearly zero before the war to over 1 million barrels per day by the end of 2025. China increased its purchases as well, importing nearly 2 million barrels per day of Russian crude. The tankers that are shipping oil from Russia to India and China have become part of Russia's shadow fleet. These are aging ships, many over 15 years old, purchased through shell companies and registered in countries like Gabon, Cameroon, and Liberia. They operate without Western insurance, making them floating environmental disasters waiting to happen. By 2024, this shadow fleet consisted of over 600 vessels, transporting Russian oil to India, China, and other buyers willing to look the other way. These tankers leave ports like Primorsk on the Baltic Sea and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, sailing without proper safety standards or transparent ownership. The shadow fleet keeps Russian oil moving, but it is a fragile and expensive system to maintain. However, it was not that big of an issue for Russia in 2022 and 2023. That is because during that time, as Western sanctions started to get implemented, Russia got help from some of its its partners. In October of 2022, the international oil cartel OPEC+, which also includes Russia, announced oil production cuts of 2 million barrels per day, which at that time became the largest reduction in oil supplies since the pandemic. Saudi Arabia led this decision, prioritizing high oil prices over any concern about helping finance Russia's war machine. The cuts pushed oil prices higher within days of the announcement. While the United States condemned the decision and President Biden called it a betrayal, for Russia this was a financial lifeline at a critical moment. Thanks to OPEC+ production cuts and continued demand from India and China, Russian oil revenues hit record levels in 2022 and 2023. Despite the war, sanctions, and the loss of the European markets, Russia earned hundreds of billions of dollars from oil exports in 2022 alone. The high prices compensated for the discounts Moscow was forced to offer to Asian buyers. These revenues allowed Putin to fund the war effort, pay soldiers, manufacture weapons, and maintain social spending to keep Russians from protesting. At that time, Western sanctions also had failed to cripple Russia's economy as quickly as expected. Moscow adapted, found new buyers, and kept the oil money flowing. That is why in late 2022, Ukraine realized that destroying Russian tanks on the battlefield was not enough. To truly defeat Russia, Ukraine needed to attack the source of Moscow's war funding. Ukrainian military intelligence identified Russia's oil infrastructure as the perfect target. Refineries process crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel that Russia needs for its military. Export terminals ship oil abroad to generate revenue. The Shadow Fleet tankers transport that oil to buyers. If Ukraine could systematically destroy these facilities and vessels, Russia's ability to fund the war would collapse. Kiev developed a strategy: strike the refineries to reduce Russia's refining capacity, hit the export terminals to disrupt shipments, and hunt the Shadow Fleet tankers to prevent oil from reaching buyers. That is why Ukrainian drones began striking Russian oil refineries with devastating effect. By the middle of 2024, Ukraine had damaged or destroyed facilities representing roughly 15% of Russia's total refining capacity. Then by the end of 2025, Ukrainian attacks were even able to shut down almost 40% of Russia's entire refining capacity at one point. These were not symbolic strikes. These were precision attacks that forced Russia to import refined fuel products at higher prices from countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan, reducing the country's export revenues and straining its budget. At the same time, Ukraine's success in attacking Russian oil infrastructure depended on first liberating the Black Sea from Russian naval control. After the war began, Russia's Black Sea fleet tried to blockade Ukrainian ports and prevent grain exports. But Ukraine fought back with its anti-ship missiles, naval drones, and long-range strikes, and the sinking of the Russian flagship Moskva in April of 2022 was just the beginning. Over time, Ukraine struck Russian vessels docked in occupied Sevastopol and even hit Russian submarine, damaged the bridge that connects occupied Crimea with Russia, and forced Moscow to relocate most of its Black Sea fleet from occupied Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. By late 2023, Ukrainian grain ships were sailing freely from Odessa, while Russian warships stayed far from the coast. With control of the Black Sea, Ukraine began hunting Russia's Shadow Fleet tankers. These aging vessels transport Russian oil from ports like Novorossiysk to buyers in India and China. In late 2025, Ukrainian naval drones struck multiple Shadow Fleet tankers, settling them ablaze and forcing expensive repairs. Ukraine even extended operations beyond the Black Sea, with intelligence reports suggesting Ukrainian forces targeted Russian oil rigs in the Caspian Sea and possibly Shadow Fleet tankers in the Atlantic Ocean. Each successful strike raised insurance costs for the Shadow Fleet and made buyers more nervous about depending on Russian oil. More importantly, Ukrainian attacks also proved that Russia's oil empire, once thought invincible, is now at risk of being fully decimated. While Ukraine was destroying Russian oil infrastructure, another threat to Moscow's oil revenues was emerging from across the Atlantic. The United States, thanks to the fracking revolution, has become the largest oil producer across the globe. By the end of 2024, American production exceeded 13 million barrels per day, more than Russia's 9 million barrels per day or Saudi Arabia's 10 million barrels per day. American companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron were producing record amounts of oil from fields in the Permian Basin of Texas and New Mexico. This all flooded global markets, putting downward pressure on prices. The more America produced, the less leverage OPEC Plus and Russia had over the market. The United States was not alone in increasing production. Canada ramped up output from its oil sands in Alberta. Norway increased production from its North Sea fields. Brazil announced new offshore discoveries that would boost its production, while Guyana went from producing zero oil in 2019 to making it possible to reach over 1 million barrels per day by 2027. All of these non-OPEC producers were taking market share away from Russia and traditional OPEC members, fundamentally changing the balance of power in global oil markets. That is why by the middle of 2024, Saudi Arabia faced a difficult choice. While the OPEC Plus production cuts had kept oil prices relatively high, they also surrendered market share to American and other non-OPEC producers. Saudi Arabia's share of global oil exports declined while American and Canadian exports increased. The kingdom's budget, dependent on oil revenues, was running deficits at prices below $85 per barrel. Yet oil prices were falling anyway because non-OPEC supply growth was now overwhelming the OPEC Plus cuts. Considering this, in September of 2024, Saudi Arabia was preparing to announce an increase in oil production in the coming months to reclaim the lost market share. This news sent oil prices tumbling, which was a disaster for Russia. After all, the combination of increased non-OPEC production and Saudi Arabia abandoning production cuts created a perfect storm for Russian oil revenues. By late 2025, oil prices had fallen to $60 per barrel, far below the $90 average Russia had enjoyed in 2022 and 2023. The discount at which Russia sells its oil to Asian buyers, along with the lower global prices, meant Russian revenues from each barrel sold had dropped significantly since 2022. Making matters worse, the costs of operating the shadow fleet, bribing officials, and evading sanctions continued to rise. Russia is now earning less money from oil while spending more resources to get that oil to the market. As a result of this, the lower oil prices and reduced export volumes created a fiscal crisis in Russia. Currently, Russia faces a federal budget deficit that is one of the highest since the fall of the Soviet Union. At the same time, the inflation in Russia remains relatively high, despite the fact that the Russian central bank holds interest rates at 16%, which is one of the highest in the world, while the country itself is sliding toward recession. All of this shows that while Putin built Russia's power on oil revenues, this dependence on one commodity has become a critical weakness. Unlike diversified economies that can withstand commodity price shocks, Russia needs oil money to pay soldiers, fund the military-industrial complex, and maintain social spending to prevent unrest. When oil revenues fall, everything falls. The government cannot simply pivot to other sources of income because Russia never developed a broad-based economy beyond resource extraction. Decades of corruption and mismanagement left Russia dependent on the one thing that Ukraine can target and the global market can undermine. Every refinery Ukraine destroys reduces Russia's capacity to process crude oil, forcing Moscow to import expensive refined products. Every shadow fleet tanker Ukraine damages raises costs and scares away buyers. Every strike on export terminals disrupts the flow of oil that generates revenue. At the same time, while Russia's oil empire burns, the rest of the world is moving forward without Russian energy. Europe has successfully replaced Russian oil and gas with supplies from Norway, the United States, Qatar, and other producers. India and China, while still buying Russian oil, are demanding steeper and steeper discounts, knowing Moscow has nowhere else to sell. American shale producers are planning to increase production even more, while renewable energy is growing rapidly in Europe and Asia, reducing long-term demand for fossil fuels. Putin invaded Ukraine believing oil revenues would finance his conquest. Instead, oil has become the weapon that will defeat him. The empire built on oil is collapsing, one destroyed refinery at a time.